Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this
Good
meeting of
evening.
the Planetary Restoration Action Group. And now, John Nissen, who circulated the agenda for today, is stuck in the waiting room. I'm not quite sure. Here he is. He's managed to get in. Hello, John. So John has circulated some thoughts to discuss today. There's a couple of other things I'd be interested to raise as well. So I'll just check. John, are you there?
Yep. I've just arrived. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So, John, you circulated some thoughts yesterday about themes for today. Would you like to speak to
that? Yes. I'll have to think of those now. Okay. So I wanted to. I'm writing a book with the help of Peter Wadhams. We need to be very positive about SRM, i.e. cooling intervention. Well, I'm also writing to somebody who's an ecologist and an economist at the same time. He did a review on behalf of the Treasury on biodiversity. So I noticed that at the time and thought perhaps I ought to write to him, but now it seems another appropriate moment to be writing to him, since we've got some more information on the economic side. But I do want, what I would really appreciate is lots of references to articles, publications, which talk about the advantages of cooling, or the need for cooling, or what's happening to biological systems as a result of heating. Obviously, we could have Robert, you could probably give me a really good reference on the Great Barrier Reef. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for.
The trouble with that is that there, you said both the advantages of cooling and the problems with heating. Now, there's a lot of stuff about the problems of heating, but then I think that there's very little stuff about the advantages of cooling, and that this is a weakness.
That's exactly the point.
This is a weakness in the thinking, because it really they ought to be the converse of each other. So, like, if you've got heating, then you should aim for cooling. But what instead we find is we've got heating, therefore we should aim for emission reduction, without a recognition that emission reduction is a very inefficient and slow way of delivering cooling. And so yeah, it's it would be there's quite a bit of literature, I believe, on poleward drift, and that is the general phenomenon that species are being found further away from the equator as they move to the location of temperature that's comfortable for them. And
what did you call that? Species drift or something?
No, poleward
drift.
Yeah, poleward.
Oh, poleward, yes. Okay.
And so, for example, in her book, The Sixth Extinction, Elizabeth Colbert discusses how this phenomenon also causes species to move up in altitude. So when a species lives on a mountain, it will gradually, its habitat will move up the mountain as the temperature rises, and eventually it will reach the top of the mountain and will have no space to rise and will go extinct. And so there are examples of that as a problem. So if it were possible to cool the temperature, then this problem of poleward drift, which is widely observed among fish species, it's much more difficult for wild animals where there are fences and humans in the way. So that's a primary biodiversity challenge, and so it's a reason why I've been saying that um, uh, albedo enhancement, one of the main benefits of albedo enhancement, is to protect and enhance biodiversity, and so that's, I think, a moral dimension of this, which it has received very little attention. So I'm glad, John, that you're starting to explore that. Yesterday, I met together with Peter Lindenmayer, one of the top climate scientists at the Australian National University. We had a long conversation with Aaron Tang, who wrote a, um, a paper quite widely read a couple of years ago called A Fate Worse Than Warming, Stratospheric Aerosol Injection and Global Catastrophic Risk. And it was very good to speak with Aaron, although his approach is completely negative about stratospheric aerosol injection and, by extension, cooling methods more broadly. So, but anyway, so those are a couple of, and I'll come back and talk about that a bit more later in this biodiversity impact context. Thanks, John.
Okay.
Others may have comments on this biodiversity question.
Yeah. Well, we know of lots of people who are eco warriors and think that that the emissions reduction is the best that can be done for saving biodiversity, whereas, as you argue, it's actually far too slow to emissions reduction effect. If it ever does have a, or would have a cooling effect, it won't be for
well, it wouldn't, because of tipping
decades.
Points. So the issue with...
well, two things. Yeah, the tipping points. But even if there weren't the tipping points, Hansen is pointing out that the equilibrium temperature for the planet under double CO2 could be as much as 10 degrees if you take into account removal of SO2 cooling. So, you know, his trajectory is very much as we have, Doug and I have been documenting for the Prague temperature trajectory diagram.
Just to ask, is that Hansen study where it talks about 10 degrees in the pipeline, has that been published properly yet?
Yeah, that's
or is
what
that
I'm
the one
referring to.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just thinking he's had a recent study which he's just asking for pre-publication input from other scientists. Is it not? Is it that one, or is it a previous one?
Yeah, it's the pre-publication one.
Right. I'm just thinking in terms of quoting, if you want to quote that as an authoritative source for somebody trying to obviously persuade of the importance of this, is it still okay to do that for a pre-publication thing? You know, how would you refer to it? Just as a pre-publication?
Oh, I think so, yes.
They call it a preprint.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a legitimate source, because Hansen is such a distinguished leader of the world climate science community. And so I certainly have not seen any critiques of his paper come out, because I think it's a very rigorous analysis that he's presented. Grant wants to speak.
One of the observations I've made of the IPCC work over the past couple of years is how they are referring only to peer-reviewed material. And that puts them deliberately, by choice, 2 years behind what is being spoken about today or being explored by the people such as Hansen. So I think his action in going to preprint is something that we should be expecting to see more of, because this gets the basic science out there in front of people long before everybody else has had a chance to poo-poo it. And you know, the review process and editors' bias against changing their minds or having the whole thing turned upside down is going to continue to suppress information that is relevant. Let me cool down my frustration. There's so many theories out here and so many models playing mine's better than yours that we are still years away from having real data on which we are able to make decisions. Many years ago in Geelong, in Australia, I went into a factory and they were in the middle of their quality improvement process. And they invited me to take a walk through their assembly area, and there in letters 10 to 12 feet tall was a statement that said, without data, you're just another fill in the blank with an opinion. And right now we are in the process of where we are as a result of competing opinions, and we're stuck in this spot. Thank you for listening to my frustration. But Hansen's as a reference is as good as anything we could expect to find. And I think we'll see more. We should be exploring using those vehicles ourselves to get our material in front of others who are yet to sign on and hopefully never will to the game that is dragging us down. Thank you.
Now we've got a couple of comments from Doug, then Herb, then Daniel.
Thank you. And Grant, I have one point on the curve for Hansen's paper, and that is Michael Mann, who has admonished him, scoffed him, and made the comment, what do you expect if something's not peer reviewed? So the only person that's weighed in verbally in a recorded video interview, which I've forgotten who it was with, has condemned Hansen. Michael Mann has condemned Hansen. That's all I want to say. That's
Thanks,
what we
Doug.
have to overcome.
Herb.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of small points. The IPCC literature, their description indicates that they do look at non-peer reviewed paper, but they basically put a higher standard. In other words, they look for other ways of collaborating its validity. So, I mean, I'm not defending the IPCC. I'm the last person to do this, and I have no idea, how frequently that's done or how widely they look at non-peer reviewed. Secondly, just a small point again about Hansen's paper. I mean, we called Hansen's paper, but it had 15, 18 different writers along with it, publish folks who put their name on the preprint. So, and also, as some of you may know, when I had a brief Twitter exchange when I commented to somebody that a few weeks ago that it was ironic that Hansen said something like, we may need geoengineering, or he probably talked about SRM. And I said, I assume that's because of all his other co-authors. And then he responded by saying, insightful inference or so. So they probably have held him back to some degree and being even more direct in terms of what he would like to see. So those are just 3 points of clarification.
Daniel.
Yeah, I've just put something into the chat about an AI program, basically helping to write a study that sort of talks about the likelihood of surpassing 2 degrees within the before 2050 is quite high up. And I haven't read the study, but it's interesting how AI, and it's very variable, but it's really progressing at some would say a scary rate. I think there's a lot more things to be scared of, but having said that, AI could be a very objective way of bluntly saying we need to do cooling directly in a way that you don't have squabbling humans arguing over their political bias. I know that there's an issue with bias in AI, of course, but I mean it's getting to a point where I saw a video about, it was actually about the risks of AI, and it was interviewing an AI chatbot that admitted that Facebook was proponent of being a proponent of AI was aiding and abetting basically the disinformation and such, and also it's but it was interesting how two AI bots from whoever the company is called that owns Facebook were talking to each other, and they started inventing their own language apparently. So the bots were talking to each other in a way that humans could not understand them. And they quickly shut this down apparently. I don't know if it's 100% true, but it's quite possible, I think, that AI developments could help bring about more definitive, more stronger arguments in a way for this sort of
I could jump in,
approach.
Daniel. I think that that's a really good point, because people may have seen how computers are now far better at chess than humans, and through artificial intelligence related fields, and have solved the game of Go to defeat the world Go master. Now, if computers can work out that sort of stuff, surely, the fact that we can see that there's a simple case for brightening the planet is something that computers could be tasked to analyze. And just the whole scenario modeling, like I find, as I mentioned, this paper by Aaron Tang, which was citing all of these termination shock and other sort of risks associated with brightening the planet. And I felt that what it was doing was just taking sort of very speculative and alarmist arguments with quite weak data, and it would be possible, like so it's this issue of how can we harness computers to strengthen our political governance, so that we can engage with this question of planetary coordination, which is needed for regulating the atmosphere, and so it's quite possible to do that. Now, I circulated this week a summary of an article that was published on Medium, which I thought was really worth reading. It's about how scientists have been underestimating the pace of climate change, and as I circulated it, there's real just extreme controversy over these things, with the IPCC scientists are claiming that other scientists have been overestimating the speed of climate change, and so there was a paper by I'll just find the reference if I can, but saying that scientists have been overestimating and others saying underestimating, and these are like, given the scale of supercomputing that they apply to their climate models, which are still quite effective, you would think that it would be possible to apply some computing power to these sort of basic questions of whether albedo enhancement is a good thing. Doug?
I had one other thing I wanted to say about Michael Mann. Actually, maybe there's a couple. And I also want to address AI. So, Michael Mann talks about the best climate science you've never heard of. And in that whole discussion, which is February of last year, he talks about, it's a little known fact that's buried within AR5, I believe, maybe it's AR6, but it's within the IPCC. So he's quoting IPCC and saying that when we reach net zero, you probably know this already, when we decarbonize, the temperature will stabilize and then begin to fall. And in addition to that, Al Gore has said the same thing, basically, quoting, I think probably pretty much quoting Michael Mann, that within 3 to 4 years of reaching true net zero, the carbon will stabilize, CO2 will stabilize, temperature will stabilize, and continue within 3 or 4 years was the key. I don't know if it's CO2 or temperature, but within 3 or 4 years, something will decline. And that totally flies in the face of Hansen. And then I want to mention that Bill McKibben and Michael Mann are buddies on Twitter. And McKibben actually posted on a hello, somebody talking?
Yeah, you're still there, go on.
McKibben actually put additional news in one of his recent posts that an AI model has shown that we will blow right by 1.5 and forget about 2.0. So Bill McKibben, who's a buddy with Mann, is countering Michael Mann with different information from this IA model. So I think
that's the same as the.
I think we need to get Michael Mann and Bill McKibben together and have. I mean, I've asked them to talk. I've asked Bill McKibben to reach out to Michael, and I pointed it point blank to him that Michael is countering Jim Hansen, who gave him the name of his organization, 350.org.
The trouble is,
I think we need to go to war with those guys.
the trouble is that Michael Mann is presenting a political argument rather than a scientific argument, and he's dressing up his political argument as science. And many people have pointed out that this argument that he said on 60 Minutes on US television that it was the new climate consensus, but it's one that's widely rejected by climate scientists. This argument that all we need to do is achieve net zero and then the climate will stabilize. Like it's like this issue of how modeling just completely leaves out anything that they don't understand. And so if you say we're going to create a model of the world climate, but if there are things that we don't understand, then we'll just ignore them, then you're really leaving yourself wide open to that risk of things that you don't understand just proving to be overwhelming, and that's a routine problem. So it's a completely ridiculous argument that Michael Mann has presented, and I think his blocking of Doug just illustrates his unwillingness to recognize that what he's doing is spinning political hope in a way that's completely unjustified, when really what we need is a debate around albedo enhancement. Now we've got Robert, Chris, then Herb, then Grant.
Hi there. Sorry I arrived late to the party this evening. I've been at a family event and I'm just home a little bit late. But just coming into this conversation, one of the point that Doug is just making, do you mind if I share my screen? Because I want to show you.
I'll just make sure that you can.
Okay, I want to show you the paper that is the basis for the IPCC's conclusion that there is no, that the temperature will stabilize.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is the, right, can you see that graph?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Here it is.
Yep.
Now I can.
Yep.
Hold for a moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So this is a graph. This paper. So let me just move this. This is a paper that is called "Is There Warming in the Pipeline?" A multi-model analysis of zero emissions commitment from CO2, and it's by McDougall and many others. And it is and some quite significant. I mean, Rogelli and Damon Matthews, who are key players in this field, and who have been major contributors to this whole debate about the impact of net zero. And this was published in 2020, and it is an update of work that was done previously for AR5. I won't go through the whole thing in detail. If I go back to this graph that I showed you, this is a graph that, no, this is the one here. So the one to focus, these are two pairs. These are one set of models and these are a second set of models. And the distinction here is simply to compare the difference between the models. But we want to look at this one here, which is the over the years after net zero. Zero is the point where you reach net zero, and this is the time afterwards. And here you've got the change in atmospheric CO2, and the same thing here, the time, but this one is temperature. So you can see that what this is telling you is that the CO2 concentration falls away, and it has, by 20 years afterwards, it's dropped by 60 parts per million. Yeah. By 100 years, it's dropped by 100 parts per million. Okay? And the other set of models have relatively similar results. It's actually this set of models, the drop is, well, it's very similar. Now here you have the temperature. So you can see this is the whole claim about net zero implying stabilized temperature. And all of these models are around the zero line. Immediately you get to net zero, you are in this zone and in both sets of models. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that now. But the basic message from this work, and the thing to remember, and it picks up on the point that Robert just made, this is an analysis that was done purely from climate models. What McDougall and his colleagues did was they set out a template for a modeling exercise. They sent it out to a whole bunch of modelers and said, can you run these for us? Not all of them replied, but the ones that did reply, they then did the analysis of the results. So exactly as Robert said, these results are entirely based on models. And the point that comes from the Hansen paper, which is radically different, is that he's basing his conclusions on empirical data, albeit empirical data from 15 to 150,000 years ago, but nevertheless, it's empirical data. And that is the big difference. And it's, I think, the detail that most people haven't yet kind of got their heads around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep. Sorry, go on, Rob.
And as far as I'm aware, I certainly haven't seen any serious commentary, either positive or negative, from other academics of standing in response to Hansen and his colleagues warming in the pipeline paper. Yet I'm hoping that something will come out. But I think some of you, I think just to finish on this one last detail, I think some of you know that last week I was at Cambridge and I spent some considerable time with Danny Rosenfeld, who I think many of you will have heard of. He's, I hadn't heard of him before, but then why would I have done? He's a very eminent Israeli climate scientist specializing in clouds, and is currently advising the chaps in Australia that are working on the Great Barrier Reef. And I discussed this paper with him, and he hadn't kind of paid much attention to it, and Hansen's a bit flaky these days, and the political content in the paper was just undermines its credibility, and he wasn't that kind of, he was kind of unmoved. He's also, I have to say, a lead author in part of the IPCC AR6, and he gave me an absolutely kind of orthodox, straight down the line, how wonderful the IPCC is response. You know, this is it. It's the science. It's unpolluted by political or any kind of policy machinations or interpretations. It's just the science. I mean, I regard that as being a little naive, but that was where he was coming from, at least. But that's the background here. So you know, it would be great to see somebody with credibility in academia actually commenting on Hansen's paper to see whether or not support emerges from it. But at the moment, I have to say when I read the paper, I don't know whether others had the same feeling. I felt that the conclusions, those three conclusions he reached, are really inappropriate in a paper of that sort. I mean, we might all agree with the message, but they are not the right place to make those comments. He should have just stuck to the science, which I think is great in the paper, but that didn't help. You know, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, first I have to agree with what Robert just said about Hanson's conclusions, bringing in his policy preferences, which are, which were not discussed or justified in the paper, and which none of the people who were authors have any particular expertise in, only undermines his work. But he's been doing that for many years. I've seen him speak at conferences and spoken to him afterwards, where he's pro-nuclear and pro sort of cap and trade, or not cap and trade, the fee and dividend, et cetera, et cetera. That's and I think it is really unfortunate, because the science needs to be given attention. I was just going to suggest much of what I've learned or been exposed to about this argument that once we reach net zero, that temperatures will stabilize very rapidly, et cetera, comes from the writings of Zeke Housefather, and I may be mispronouncing his last name. Many of you may know of him. And I found, I followed him on Twitter for years, and he's one of the most open-minded and responsive and good-natured people I've encountered on Twitter, which is maybe not saying much given the nature of Twitter. Whenever I ask him a question, he'll respond in 20 minutes usually. And interestingly, now he's taken a new position as the chief climate scientist at Stripe, a private company focused on CDR, using private. And I know CDR is not our primary focus here, but I just bring up the question whether either here or at HPAC, it may be useful to consider inviting somebody like Zeke, and really, sort of expressing our concerns that we talk about today and other times here about the shortcomings of the kinds of arguments that are made, and to see, if we could engage in a constructive dialogue. So anyway, just throw that out for your consideration.
Thanks, Herb. Grant.
Thank you. I have a question as to the reality of the dates given for net zero, whatever that really means, and just looked at an article I earmarked from Saturday's LA Times, where BP and Shell have both taken major steps backwards from their commitments to green energy support as one of their highlighted investments. And secondly, both have significantly reduced their emission reduction goals. I couple that information up with the video I watched last week of the rising costs of mining and extraction and materials required to create our grand new future. And I am looking at the fact that both Chevron and Exxon have made record profits and are projecting their businesses will thrive and continue to thrive for many years to come. The chairman of Chevron said, we'll be around long after the net zero expectation, and we'll still be dependent on fossil fuels. So the business realities are not in line with the arrival of net zero inside the original time frame. And so even with, if there is zero temperature impact, here we are again. Models are telling us what we can do, and we have no data and no plan to do experiments to find that data. So I think we're in for a continuing requirement to use fossil fuels to sustain the economic well-being of our planet. Now, everybody can say until there's a large change in social environments to allow that to change, I don't see that movement getting any more stronger than it has been so far.
Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. I would like to say this group is so interesting because we take the time to look at the science and look at the psychology and the economics. And I'm hoping that we could do what I think Doug and Herbert both suggested, which is having a symposium or a workshop to bring some of these ideas, crystallize them so that we're not just speaking with each other and tease out the ideas or mediate them or review them with the major proponents. I mean, Doug's already suggested that idea. I also wanted to say that Suzanne Reid sent around a workshop on solar radiation management that Gideon Futerman had organised, which already did that kind of what I've just said, but it was specifically on SRM. And so in summary, like, I think this is an excellent discussion group, and I always read all the posts and all the excellent work, especially Robbie, that you do, digging into things and commenting, but I'd like to take the synthesizing role outside from ourselves into a wider forum. And
Thanks.
I'm happy to be on a small working group, but I think what we're doing is invaluable, but it needs a wider audience.
Doug.
Did you say, I'm sorry, did you say my name?
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about assumptions. Robert Chris showed a couple of charts, the one on the left, which was that exponential decline, conjures an email that Stephen Salter sent earlier today and was responded to by Tom Garreau. And Stephen said, okay, so when we reach the point where we're not putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, wouldn't the CO2 in the atmosphere start to decline at the same rate that it went in, or something to that effect? And Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong, but Tom Garreau came back and said, absolutely, it's going to take 100,000 years for that change to happen, not 20 years, 100,000 years. Am I interpreting that right, Stephen? I'll give you the floor.
Not correct.
Turn on your mic.
I think it's about 500 years to 1,000 years. Based on
Well,
all the
Tom
evidence.
Garreau said 100,000 years.
No, Tom's incorrect about carbon dioxide. No, it's well established that the oceans will take 500 to 1,000 years to re-equilibrate the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels.
It's definitely not 20 to 40 or 50 years for sure.
No, it's
So-
500 to 1,000, which is still, we'd still have to actively accelerate the return of carbon
So
dioxide.
the point is, I'm sorry, Brian. So the point is, you're agreeing with me. The assumptions, we need to look at the assumptions that these people are using when they run these models. And it sounds to me, it looks to me from those charts that Robert showed, they have the wrong assumption and built into the model.
Yeah,
Stephen.
20 to 40 years is off by an order of magnitude.
So how can any
Okay.
model be considered accurate?
Before we go any further, I think there ought to be a response to Rebecca. Rebecca's made an offer, and I think that would be an excellent thing. And perhaps we could, certainly when Robert comes over to the UK, we could have a meeting perhaps in Cambridge. We could try and organise one there. I don't know if Rebecca has some other idea to do something sooner or perhaps later. Rebecca?
No, I think we should take our time. And so if you actually like the seed of that idea, John, Doug and myself have been chatting offline, and obviously I've got easier access to my dear friend Robbie because we're in the same time zone. So what I will do is write up what I've just said, because I've been making notes myself, and send it to a small group. Like everyone here has the most excellent brain as well as the energy we're putting in, but discussions can become a bit unwieldy if they're huge. But I'm happy to, like, I think what Gideon Futerman has done, it blew my mind, and I've asked Suzanne a question about it. So thank you, John, for your affirmation, and I shall take an action pretending that my name is Luke Eiserman, like he was on about action. So I'll do something too. I'll get a little tiny ball rolling about a workshop and a seminar to crystallize things.
Yeah. So we can work on what kind of things to have in that.
That's what I mean by
seminar.
that's what I mean by getting a ball rolling. I'll just do a one pager so that it can spark ideas and we can work it up together.
Yeah, we should try and address the various audiences for our message, which, you know, economists, ecologists, young people, Extinction Rebellion type people who are prepared to make a real fuss and get listened to, like Greta Thunberg. So
yes. So just to respond to those suggestions, I'll certainly be in the UK from the 19th of May to the 8th of June, and Peter Wadhams has proposed to convene a conference in Cambridge during that time, and so I'd like to help to organise that, and a couple of people have expressed interest in it. Now, I did have some other comments on Robert Chris's, but what I'd like to do is go to Stephen Salter first, and then I'll come back, and then there's a couple of other people with their hands up. So, Stephen.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. The question I raised was the fact that there's a large amount of CO2 in the oceans. I've seen between 40 and 50 and maybe 60 times more in the oceans than in the atmosphere. And the question I was asking, and I don't know the answer, is if we do get to net zero, is the CO2 in the oceans going to come back out? It's a question of the vapor pressure of CO2. And as far as I can see, it will come out about the same speed as it went in. But some people are saying it would be even slower than that. Now, if it does come out,
yeah, it would be slower.
Yeah. If it does, it means that getting to zero might stop things getting a lot worse, but it won't make them any better. If it does, it's going to be very, very slow. So the damage has been done and is continuing and may very well not be reversible just by stopping.
Yes, that's a good point, Stephen. And the short answer is that 2,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide has been emitted by humanity over the past 2 centuries, of which 1,000 remains in the atmosphere, and probably another 500 to 1,000 is now in the oceans, which will eventually come back out again. When we go back down, it's like
that doesn't sound like 60 times. That's less than 60.
Oh, no. The actual total carbon that's in the ocean is 45 times the entire carbon in the atmosphere. So there's plenty of room in the ocean for more, but it needs to be a healthy biological pump would keep it out of the surface ocean and into the middle and deep ocean from whence it came.
And also to prevent the acidification, which is a major concern. Now, I've put up this graph that Robert Chris alerted us to earlier again, and the concern that I have is that this zero emission commitment, supposedly being achieved, say 2050 or 2070, would occur with a CO2 level around 500 parts per million and a CO2 equivalent level well above 600 or 700 million, parts per million. And so you've got this sense of, a stabilization at well over double historical CO2 level. And as Robert was explaining, this is entirely based on models, computer models from people who responded based on data that they could measure. And so it doesn't include anything that is unknown. So it's really quite worthless. And so for Michael Mann to say that this assertion of a speed of decline is consensus, and that's his argument. And David Keith has also accepted that claim, which I was very surprised at. But to say that that's a consensus, which just completely ignores any unknown factors, is really quite unscientific. And so, it's we just had the climate update at the Australian National University last week, and the main presentation from Professor Mark Howden, who's an IPCC leader, was on the theme of it's getting worse faster than we expected. And we can all see that with extreme weather. And so extreme weather is getting worse. So there are all of these unanticipated effects that have been left out of models. So reliance on models about a projection 50 years, 80 years into the future is really quite unscientific. Now, we'll go back to Brian. I'll just stop sharing as next person who had their hand up. Brian.
Yes, thank you, Robert.
Sorry, Brian, do you mind if I just interrupt very briefly? Because Robbie,
go ahead.
Before you move on from that graph, could you just scroll back to paragraph 2.1 of that paper? Because I think it would be very helpful to everybody to understand where that graph comes from and what they understood to be net zero. Okay? Yeah,
okay, I'll see how I go.
I've
just expanded it so that we can see it.
It's on page 2990.
Okay, so let's see where 2.1, 2.3. Bear with us. 2.1 protocol and simulation.
Right, okay, fine. Right now, just stop there. Stop right there. Right. So you'll see the second sentence here. There's the protocol requested modeling groups to conduct 3 idealized simulations. Just read this paragraph. A and B. Type A, which was the main one, where simulations they're initialized from one of the standard climate model benchmark experiments in which specified atmospheric CO2 concentration, get this, increases at a rate of 1% per year from its pre-industrial value of around 285 parts per million until quadrupling, referred to as the 1% CO2 simulation in the climate model in the CMIP thing. And the 3 type A simulations are initialized from there, and they then looked at, just going down a couple of lines, after the desired cumulative emissions of whether 750, 1,000 or 2,000 petagrams of carbon, remember this is in carbon, not CO2, after the desired cumulative emissions is reached, the models are set, get this, to a freely evolving atmospheric CO2 mode with 0 further CO2 emissions. Okay, so that's what they've done. They've taken pre-industrial, they've ramped it up at an even 1% per annum to either 750, 1,000 or 200 or 2,000 parts petagrams of carbon. And then they've switched it off in one go. And that's what all these models are addressing. Now, that, of course, isn't the real world.
Yes, very good point, Robert. We'll just continue and hand on to Brian.
Yeah, so I think Robert brings up a good point, and that is, if you went past 1,000 parts per million, I think that's what they're suggesting. And then you switched it off, and then you relied on the oceans and the soils to absorb carbon. It's possible they would uptake fairly, I mean, in decades, but that's a really horrific scenario. I mean, we're scheduled, James Hansen is saying it's not out of the question that with the next strong El Nino, we could exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. I mean, that could be as early as next year. So we're dealing with some dire situations that this decade, you could be looking at 1.5 so much faster. All that said, I want to go back to some of those Chevron comments and responses that, long after net zero is dead, that fossil fuels will still be here. And I would just like to offer in response some information from the very conservative International Energy Authority or agency, IEA, which said that now solar PV is the lowest cost electricity in history, cheaper than coal, cheaper than oil, cheaper than gas. And thus we do have, from an economic perspective, a path forward if we include grid scale energy storage as part of that. We have been working over the past dozen years on thermal energy storage, which promises to be half the price of batteries for the next decade or longer, and gives a reason for the grid to exist. So I think there is an opportunity for an abundance of energy. I think we will need to pass something like the carbon dividend, which effectively provides a predictable and rising price on carbon. And I hope we can alter the reality of Chevron and others. I had heard about the BP doubling down on oil and gas exploration, which is very concerning. But I do have a question for Grant or others, and that is, what is the latest news from Shell as to their commitment on Scope 3 decarbonization, but most importantly, their commitment to renewable energy? If Grant or others have some information on that over the last few weeks, that would be helpful.
Grant, do you have an immediate response?
He's muted. He needs to unmute. Grant.
I have this article, Brian, and the best I could do is send you a copy of it. And
That'll be fine. Thank you so
But-
much. I look forward to reading it. We're
okay,
trying to figure out where we get our funding from, and we've got to make sure it's from groups that are going to be responsible for the years to come.
yes, got it.
Thank you.
Uh,
All right.
Grant,
Back
do you
to you,
have the
So-
title of that article, or is it one that you can put into the chat?
Oh, he's muted again.
All right. Well, we'll let Grant have a think about that, and we'll just. Brian, are you finished? Or
Yes,
we
I
can
am.
move on to
Thank you
Daniel.
very much, Robert. Back to
Yeah,
you.
can we move on or back to our main topic, which is SRM, and how do we get people to agree that it's needed and support a movement? I think we've got a chance, perhaps that's even optimistic, but anyhow, a chance of getting a movement, a tipping point in public opinion that this strategy that IPCC is espousing of emissions reduction only is not working, and we do need urgent SRM as a stopgap. We don't need to be fighting the people who want to reduce emissions or the fossil fuel companies who don't want to emissions reduction too quickly. We don't need to fight either of them. We need to fight for preventing tipping points, and the tipping points are ignored in the IPCC models, and that's one reason why they're hopelessly optimistic. It's not just a net zero debate. It's the immediacy of the tipping points. The risk is huge because of the impacts. We don't know when the impacts are going to be, but we do know, we have some idea of how large the impacts are, because we're talking about 2 meters of sea level rise quite suddenly. If the Greenland ice sheet collapsed and triggered a collapse of the Thwaites Glacier, between them they could easily produce a couple of meters in a few decades. It's happened before in geological history, so it could happen again, and the scenario of rapid warming followed by ice sheet, partial ice sheet collapse is something that happened at the end of the Younger Trias, and the rate of temperature rise and the rate of sea level rise is very salutary, because that's the kind of thing we're facing. So the geology supports this idea of reducing risk. But the other thing is we can be very positive that if we do this cooling judiciously, we should be able to reverse climate change and increase worldwide posterity and maintain biodiversity and do all sorts of good things. And I wanted to have lots of references from you all as to the good things that would be done by the cooling, as well as avoiding the bad things.
Thanks, John. Look, we'll just continue with people who have their hand up, and I think take on board that comment.
Can I have some input? I'm asking for input because that's what this meeting was going to be about.
If people want to provide input on that suggestion, then please put your hand up, and we'll just take that into account. So yes, but we'll just go to Daniel and then Brian.
Hi. Yeah, it ties into what John's saying about the communication and how having a positive message about cooling is important. But just the other day, some for work actually, I might have an opportunity to have a talk and communicate with some fairly senior people at NatWest, the bank. Basically, they were interested when he mentioned that I'm, spending some time doing this sort of thing about cooling, and I think marine cloud brightening was mentioned, for instance, and it was a senior sort of business relationship person, but they said they could introduce me to some people, like for instance in their team that's to do with decarbonisation. And I know amongst banks, NatWest has just done something which I know other banks are under pressure from Greenpeace and etc. But actually, NatWest have now said they're not going to give any further loans for oil or gas exploration, and they want to end that for existing clients as well. So they've taken a relatively bold step in terms of what they see as climate action. So I think there's an opportunity there if I've got someone then who's interested in what we've got to say it. But I want to know, obviously you got my email, etc. Before I go to them, I want to get a very clear, concise message about maybe the opportunity of investing in cooling technology rather than just investing in divestment and carbon reduction. And obviously I've got a broad array of sources I could use, but I think it's really important as well to have the positives as well as just talking about the fear of what may happen in the next couple of decades and the devastating effects of relying on net zero as an aim. So I'm very keen to get some communication going while there's this momentum within NatWest, obviously, because they're doing this announcement I think this week, and there's been stuff in the press in the UK anyway about their ending oil investments. So it might be a really good opportunity for us to get some message across. But I'm thinking who where could I tell them there's a something? I suppose it's a matter of where they can invest, isn't it? As well as stop investment. So that's it's going to be a challenge. I know we've got this broad thing where we've got this huge amount of investment going into decarbonisation across the board, and they have their own department for that. So it's a matter of, I think, if I got a conversation maybe with someone from that department, persuading them that they should divvy up the money between decarbonisation and other technologies that could have a quicker effect and more efficient effect on combating climate change. So that's all I want to say.
What I suggest is that you refer them to tipping points, and that the IPCC hasn't regarded these. It's swept the problem under the table and not dealt with tipping points in their models. So all their models of climate change and the speed of climate change disregard the tipping points, and the main tipping points are in the Arctic. So what is needed is cooling of the Arctic, and there they can have some influence because they can say they can recommend that exploration, oil and gas exploration in the Arctic should be on a moratorium until something has been done about refreezing the Arctic. So that they can't actually put money towards refreezing the Arctic, and you can't expect them to do that. But they can influence the industries, the insurance industry and the financial viability, stability people to say that if we don't refreeze the Arctic, we will have a major instability in world economics, a huge instability. And that's partly why I wanted this meeting, because I want people to help me on the subject of how do we persuade economists and banks and people over the importance of this refreezing of the Arctic.
Before we get into detail in this conversation, I think we need to be very careful about what we're saying, because I fear that you are overstating the case. In AR6 Working Group 1, there are 110 references to tipping points. Even in the policy summary, there are references to tipping points and their potential for destabilizing the system. So it is not true to say that AR6 and the IPCC has ignored tipping points or hasn't taken into account. There is a quite comprehensive analysis of it. What they haven't done, and where we do need to take issue with them, is not that they've ignored it in the science, in the presentation, but they haven't joined up the dots and said, hey guys, this is the science, what are we going to do about it? That's the problem. It's not that it's not mentioned, it's not that it's been treated in a perfunctory fashion, quite the contrary. It's that they simply haven't joined up the dots. And I think that is a somewhat different interpretation of where we're at than the one you just presented. And we need to be careful about how we do this.
Before we go on, I just want to note that we've got a couple of new people who are in the meeting, and in particular, I'd like to invite Rebecca Gordon to introduce herself. So, if Rebecca, perhaps if you could say hello, and then we'll move back to Brian.
Hi, yeah, I'm Rebecca Gordon. I was invited here by Jonathan Cole. He's been talking about your group to me for quite a long time, and I'm thrilled to hear what everyone's saying. It's so essential that people who are capable of reading these research papers can talk to each other and debate it. And I wish the world stage was watching, because I think most people just have no clue about this stuff. And it's so hard on a daily basis interacting with people and trying to get people interested in working on climate change stuff. I have a couple daughters who, I've been interested in this stuff for 30 years, and I couldn't get my daughters interested in it. They're just swept up on the treadmill of business as usual. So yeah, I mean, I'm part of the MEER organization, MEER, the MEERs for energy. I'm drawing a blank.
Earth energy rebalancing.
Yeah, and it's like I haven't really felt effective in that organization, so I'm just kind of frustrated about what I can do. I mean, I quit my job so that I could work on that, but it just turned out to be like such an insurmountable task to get started with the mirror project. So I feel like they are making a lot of progress, but it's really difficult to tap into that and put boots on the ground for that. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. I am now considering, going back to work. I'm an architect, so I'm considering just getting back on the treadmill myself and just going to get another job in the industry that I have been working in forever. So
Thanks
anyway,
for
nice
saying hello,
to meet you
Rebecca.
all.
It's
Yes.
really good, and I really take your point that it would be great if some of the conversation here was on the world stage, and the fact that it's not, I think, is pretty alarming to me. You know, I'd like to see this sort of stuff in mainstream media and in scientific papers, but finding the ways to achieve that is quite difficult.
One more thing I'd just like to add is I am personal friends with Guy McPherson. So if any of you have anything that you would like to say to Guy, or if you want to talk to him, he lives fairly nearby me. I live in Vermont, and he's become a pretty good friend. So I am nowhere near the scientific caliber. Like I am not a scientist. I am an architect. So, but anyway, it's interesting to be able to talk to him and get his perspective. And
Yeah, Guy is one of the most noted alarmists for people who haven't come across him. He's very much convinced that we're on a path to extinction, and has been presenting, a very depressing message about climate change for many years, but a bit marginal.
I was going to say, isn't he about the most chirpy pessimist in the world? I mean, he's basically got this incredibly pessimistic message, but he actually puts it across in a rather sort of like high energy and like positive energy sort of way. Oh, let's enjoy our lives because they won't last long.
right.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot, Rebecca.
I did a joint presentation with him at Bristol, in Bristol, and so I would love to renew contact with him, because he gave his message first of doom. His aim was to get at least one woman in the audience crying. And that was, he called that a convert.
Oh no.
And yeah, so yeah, quite. He's
Well, maybe Guy McPherson would be an interesting person to invite to the HPAC. To
I didn't get really much feedback from him on the idea of geoengineering to avoid catastrophe. So I'd be very interested in renewing an acquaintance with him if he can remember me. So do we have your email address, Rebecca?
I'll put it in the chat. It's cloudpair@gmail.com.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Now let's go back to Brian.
Yes, well, first of all, I'd like to say that doom and gloom is not only demotivating, it's dangerous. And the reason it's dangerous is it leads people towards inaction. And the reality is, as a technologist, I can say that fully 15 or 20% of the problem is technological. And over 50% of the problem is actually the will to change. And what we need is not demotivation. And it's not, getting people in tears and just, wanting to do nothing. It's about a call to action that there is actually great hope for the future. And we must build the grassroots support, because surely the greatest, I'd say, inertia that we're dealing with is the inertia of business as usual. But there's a huge opportunity to turn that around. In response to Daniel, he was asking about cooling that could be actually investable. And Ashleys did a paper 10 years ago on how restoring natural upwelling could in fact cool the planet substantially by bringing cooler water up near the surface. That's a renewable energy resource, according to Professor Andrew Thompson of Caltech, a Southern oceanographer. And then beyond that, there are more, and I would say that marine permaculture is a technology that can be invested in today. So I'm happy to follow up as desired. It's something we're actively working with a number of banks in Europe on presently. And it's something that it's time to scale to hectares. We have 1/10 of a hectare in the water now, and we anticipate having a full hectare in the water later this year, which is the economically sustainable level at which we can help thousands of coastal communities to go from collapsing to surviving and eventually to thriving by restoring natural upwelling and marine fisheries. So it's a good start. It's potentially a wedge. We say it's a dozen years to a gigaton if we can triple the area under deep water irrigation every year for the next dozen years. And that's the exponent that we're committed to scaling in a fairly traditional way. And we're going to have to use capital in order to get there. But I think that could help thousands of communities and be a distributive wealth creator that's not concentrating wealth, but actually enabling those coastal communities to thrive in the future. I see that as really important. Robert Chris touched on the IPCC, and there is a disconnect. You know, there is an implicit moral contract with the IPCC, and that is that the IPCC would go and observe and predict what will happen. And then civil society needs to come through and decide to act rationally based on those conclusions. Now, the conclusions are overwhelmingly compelling in AR6, but we have a broken contract, and the broken contract is the will to reduce emissions, to remove the 2,400 gigatons that's been emitted, and to repair the climate. And it does start with refreezing the Arctic. In answer to John Nissen's remarks, it starts, you know, we've seen this movie before in the last millennium, and it begins with charismatic megafauna. You know, decades ago, it was about save the whales, and literally save the whales had a huge grassroots effect. And I believe this will have to be a grassroots kind of policy shift in order to make it work. And I would say that our charismatic megafauna are moving from whales to polar bears and walruses. And until now, there's been no way that we could help the walruses or the polar bears. But it starts there. It says we need to refreeze the Arctic, and that's the habitat for these and other creatures, and ultimately rebrighten the planet. And I mean, not only physically rebrighten it, but also intellectually rebrighten the planet to commit to actually, you know, getting back to a healthy climate. And we can achieve that in a good and positive way. And we need to do it one step at a time. And there are multiple technologies that'll enable us to refreeze the Arctic. And this needs to be a compelling value proposition. And it starts with save the polar bears and save the walruses. So that's just a brief outline of what we found has worked over the past 15 years at the Climate Foundation, and happy to help in developing a campaign that would enable that grassroots support. This is
It's
Brian.
a very inspiring and positive message that you're giving there, Brian. Thank you for that. No, just hang on, John.
Can we take you up on that offer, Brian? Yeah.
Certainly happy to follow up, John. Back to you, Robert.
Yeah, to build up a real momentum behind
I think
positive
that
message.
What Brian has said is a much better way of framing how climate possibilities should be presented in public. And I think people are well aware of Guy McPherson's very pessimistic approach, and I think what Brian is sharing is optimism. And so being able to be optimistic about our planetary future in the face of the major challenges is something that most people just simply cannot. Most people respond by denial. Optimism is achieved. And so I think in addition to brightening the planet as something that would address albedo and intelligence, that just having a smarter approach to our relationship to Earth systems. There's also this question of mood that, so there's a triple meaning of brighten, which is albedo, intelligence, and mood. That we've got this planetary depression, which is people just feel that there's nothing that can be done. And the thing is that there are practical solutions. So thanks very much, Brian, for that framing of the question. We'll unless Brian wants to respond, we'll move back to Robert Chris.
It's wonderful, Robert. I think there is, and that's a great insight. Rebrightening the planet should be about planetary rebrightening, intellectual rebrightening, and mood rebrightening. So thank you for that wonderful contribution, Robert.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, this is I've not come across Guy McPherson before. I just read his just very quickly the short biopic on Wikipedia, and it's I have to say I smiled. It says that he is known for inventing and promoting doomer fringe theories, such as near-term human extinction, which predicts human extinction by 2026. So we're not far off it. But I think that whenever this conversation is had, I kind of curl up a little bit because I really dislike the word optimism, because it always feels to me that we should be talking about being realistic, not being optimistic. Optimism is a kind of you know, we need to just have our feet on the ground. You know, what's possible, what can be done, not what do we hope can be done. And I think that there's a danger that we get carried away with our own rhetoric if we focus too much on optimism. And I really take a lot of what Brian was saying just now. I mean, I really agree with him in principle, but I think that the thing that we need to be very aware of is that this bright future is going to be a future that is radically different from the present and the immediate past. You know, it will be a world which is geopolitically quite different from the current one. It'll be a world where the global economy is quite different from the current one. And the transition from here to there is extremely opaque. You know, I know where in A, I know where B is, but how we get from A to B from a political point of view, I think is very, very challenging. And I would disagree with Brian that it's 50% about will to make the effort and to make the change. I think it's 99% the will to do these things. And it always has been. We've never been short of solutions. It's all about wanting to make it happen. And people don't want to make it happen, just like Rebecca's daughters, because they're wrapped up in the here and now. Most of these people don't see the real impact. They don't see this danger creeping up on us. They're not aware of it, and they just want to get on with their lives and do the normal thing. And I think getting that shift so that people really do get the message is frankly quite challenging. And I have, from an academic perspective, approached this from a adaptive systems theory perspective. And regrettably, I have to say regrettably, what that tells me is that you don't get the changes that Brian is talking about without the system first collapsing. And there are systemic, I'm not going to give a lecture now on complex adaptive systems, but there are very sound reasons why the system has to collapse in order for those changes to come about. A collapse is a big word, and it can mean different things, different levels of collapse and so on. But broadly speaking, that big shift from where we are now to where we need to be will be traumatic in any circumstance, and it will be resisted. And the resistance makes it even more traumatic when it happens. And so I think that we need to be really, really cognizant of those challenges, and they are the root of all of the reluctance to act. And when we're talking about getting our message about albedo enhancement out to the world, those are the forces which we are coming up against, because we've got a message which they don't want to hear. They simply don't want to hear it. And that's a real problem. And I don't know how you get through. And you know, I mean, I'm going to look at Guy McPherson's stuff to see whether he's coming from the same point of view as I am. But I genuinely do. I'm not pessimistic. I think that actually there is a really bright new future out there, but there is a pile of shit to get through first before we get there. And
I think, Robert, it's possible.
I don't think it's nearly as traumatic as you say. Supposing there was a tipping point and people accepted that the need for stratospheric aerosol injection to cool the Arctic. Supposing that was accepted, Now, what would happen? Some super tankers would be refitted to spray SO2. They inject it at 50 degrees or 60 degrees north at places that's been suggested in the paper, recent paper about SAI. The sunshine with 1% or so extra reflection of sunshine.
John,
Cooling
John,
would take place.
The point, John, you're doing what you always do.
It would have.
You're doing what you always do. Let me interrupt you. I'm going to stop this because you're doing what you're doing. We know that the technology works. We know that it's great. The problem is not about the science. The problem is about getting people to do it. So it doesn't matter how easy it is to cross the street. If you can't convince people to cross the street, they won't. So going on about how successful the science is not the problem.
You're saying that we need to wade through shit and we're going to have a revolution in economics. I'm saying that's rubbish.
I'm not saying that I'm not sorry. I didn't say that we need to. I said that we will have to, because that's the way that systems operate. There is inevitability in my view, and we can struggle to avoid that. But I am not confident that, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, that we can actually muster the forces to make that change in people's attitudes before it is too late. Because we have to remember all the time, and it's something that I think everybody in this group is aware of, that there is incredible inertia in the climate system. And you can't turn it on a sixpence, as we would say in England. You can't turn it that fast. So if you don't put in place the policies some decades and put the policies in place in earnest some decades before they are needed, in quotes, by the time you get there, it's going to be too late. If we don't do the albedo enhancement for another 30 years, will there be any point in doing it? I'm not sure. So these are the issues. It's not about the availability of the science. It's not about the cost issues. It's not about any of that. It's about getting the political impetus behind doing it. And that is a big issue, because it's not just about the politicians. It's also about the public, because the politicians are broadly speaking, not leaders. They are responders to public demand. And
I've written about that. I've written a little piece about that. Did you read that, Robert?
I don't think I have. I'm not sure. No, I've written quite a lot. I've read a lot of what you've written. I can't recall that particular piece.
Yeah, very recent, just last day or two.
Okay, fine. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, look, yeah. I'd like to go back to Robert's question about the balance between realism and optimism. And I think the way systems change is that there are people who are outliers who drag the middle of the debate across from its current position. And so in this context, I would hope that formulating an optimistic vision of the future is in the context where the dominant climate consensus is incredibly pessimistic, and to the point that most people don't really admit to their pessimism because it's for various mental health and other reasons. So if it's possible to formulate a realistic vision that is at the same time optimistic, then maybe that's got potential to cut through. Now we've got Brian, then Daniel, then Herb.
Thank you, Robert. So first of all, I'd like to agree with Robert Chris that we're not going to be able to restore the climate that was pre-industrially, but there is great hope that we can regenerate healthy climate. And we should distinguish those two, because it won't be the same as it was before, but it will be a bright future. And I think that's very important to distinguish. Robert does highlight the fact that we've got this huge hegemony that's preserving business as usual, citing BP and others, and doubling down on fossil fuel exploration, things like that, which is a very sad outcome. And Chevron's, claim that they'll be around long after net zero is gone. We've got to change that. And you know, there are a couple ways of doing it. And sadly, you know, the prospect of having to collapse civilization in a way is daunting. I will cite the science fiction literature, and that is go to Isaac Asimov and his Foundation trilogy, which discusses Foundation and Empire, which the purpose of the Foundation was to survive the collapse. Foundation and Empire is about the collapse, and Second Foundation is actually the backup that actually provides the solution and is able to reboot civilization. So in fact, we named the Climate Foundation some 20 years ago after Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And our purpose is to smooth the transition to a bright future by avoiding what might be necessary. And I'm actually going to cite there are a couple of ways of getting there. And a lot of it is about social acceptance. And I think that's what John Nissen is really alluding to. We have to build the social acceptance for refreezing the Arctic. And that starts with the charismatic megafauna, as we've described. Now, I've got a tale of two countries to share with you. And that is in the 1800s, there was an analogous disruption that countries had to get over. And that was slavery and serfdom. And a tale of two countries are, first of all, we're probably all familiar with the American Civil War and the loss of millions of lives associated with the revolution. I mean, the revolution that occurred, the Civil War of 1860 to 1865 in the United States. And sadly, that was a terrible cost to the United States and others. But I want to also go back to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and that is Alexander Herzen and his role in emancipating the serfs in Russia, which is perhaps less well known. But he started Russia's first underground newspaper in the 1840s, 1850s. It was called Kolokol, which in Russian means the bell. And he was actually forced to in exile to go to London and to France. And from there, he wrote the Kolokol, which was broadly distributed to the intelligentsia in Russia, and actually resulted in 1865, the very same year, I believe the Tsar emancipated the serfs without a single shot being fired. Now that is in a picture of an alternative future that is not broadly described except in Tom Stoppard's The Coast of Utopia, which is a 3-play description of Herzen and his life. And I'm just happy to, thank you for that, Robert. 2/3 of a million deaths. So how can we avoid the collapse of civilization? I think it's to build a new bell, a new kolokol for our civilization. And it starts with writing those newsletters. And literally, if we can get that word out, you know, the modern equivalent of the bell, if you will, to suggest there are in fact peaceful ways that we can make a just climate transition. So this is Brian. I'm complete. Happy to follow up.
Right. Look, now we've reached the end of our usual time. I'm finding this such an interesting conversation. I'd be happy to continue for another half hour. So people are welcome to drop out as they wish, but we will continue for another half hour, and I'll just go on to Daniel.
Yeah, talking of Russia, and it's fascinating hearing about Dr. Herzen's ancestor and such profound effect on emancipation there. But what about Russia and the whole suspicion and geopolitical situation? And you got balloons being fired out. You got they've increased the resolution to find those high-flying objects in the stratosphere now, and just the concept of refreezing the Arctic using any sort of technology in you know, where Russia has a 4,000-kilometer coastline there. We just got to sort this geopolitical hatred and you know, the terrible situation out before we could even, you know, how could there be any of these technologies deployed to the Arctic until we have, you know, Russian scientists working with the Alaskan and you know, the US, etc. again. They've now, like, I think they're pulling astronauts off the space station, aren't they? To you know, it's just yeah, we just got to get through that hurdle. And in the meantime, I think yeah, building up grassroots support and through communications on social media and newsletters, etc., so we can get, you know, a broad readership about, you know, this positive but realistic future possibility through harnessing other than, you know, the three-pronged approach, as Herb would say, or the three-stalled, you know, three-legged stool, or whatever you say. You know, these other approaches are essential for that to be realistic. And yeah, so I think a lot to be done before we can say, yeah, let's go into the Arctic with our balloons or our big spray vessels or whatever. I think, you know, there's other things that can be done, and of course there are technologies such as using kelp forests and regrowth of, you know, the sort of thing that Brian's done, which Russia aren't going to worry about. And they're actually, you know, plenty of things we can do well away from there in the meantime, while we get that message across and try and get to the point where hopefully it's the unifying thing that would come across. But maybe after 2024, maybe that would be a time when there'll be such huge impacts on global food systems and things. I'm hoping they're not, but I'm being a bit of a, you know, McPherson-esque person when I think about the possibility of that, especially as Hanson's identified the you know, big El Nino combined with huge you know, levels of sunspot activity and that sort of thing combining. Maybe in the next couple of years we'll see something that will you know, shock the establishment into actually thinking, yeah, we've got to come together. We've got to make this the priority over, you know, building up our military. You know, who knows? But I'm thinking we can't just do the let's go into the Arctic thing, even if we were given all the tools now, because Russia would just blow them all up, quite frankly. I think.
Thanks, Daniel.
So-
Let's go to Herb.
Thanks, Robert. It was mentioned previously that the need for people have talked about a need for vision that's if it's optimistic, it needs to be optimistic / realistic. Finding that right balance, you know, is really hard, because if you go in one direction, you lose people who want to get hope and experience and goals, and in the other direction. Anyway, but in fact, for what it's worth, and I think it's worth a lot. Of course, I'm one of the authors. We have 3 of the authors of a document that HPAC prepared last year, Brian and Robert Tulip and myself, called A Vision for a Healthy Planet, that was also written by Suzanne, by Ron Bayman, by Mike McCracken, one of the finest climate scientists on the planet, and Leslie Field. And, you know, we got your input at HPAC, and of course, there's huge overlap between the folks that are here in HPAC. We tried to, you know, and it took us 10 months to write 15 pages because we had to sort of try to figure out the right balance ourselves. And I'm sure if you ask all of us privately, we grumble a bit. Oh, it should have had more of this or less of that. But nonetheless, I think it's an important start. But we only got, then we at several meetings of HPAC, and maybe it was we should have done a better job. We really asked folks to either give us a critique, or if you like it, sign on. We only had 12 people. If you go to our website, that has signed on to endorse it. And so anyway, I throw that out. I will post it again in the chat here. I'd like everyone to take a look at that. We also made a commitment last year to do a 2.0 this year, you know, with your input and based upon what changes in the real world and so forth, to keep updating it and making it relevant. But there's no point in keeping updating and making it relevant if it's not going to be applied and used and circulated out in the world, along with whatever other arguments we can make for Daniel, the climate triad, you know, as I call it, the 3-legged stool, whatever. So anyway, I really urge you to take a look at it. Give us your feedback. Send us a note if you'd like to endorse it. Your name will be on the website, or if you'd like to endorse it anonymously, because you'd rather not have your name on the website, that's fine. But you know, and if you've got other ideas, and again, we all sort of work together. It's Prague 1 week and NOAC and HCA and HPAC, but we have, you know, similar goals and similar aspirations. I think that what we need is it's obviously only one document and one tool, but we need to develop a set of tools. And then we need to have the commitment to take those out into the world. You know, we all belong to probably a dozen or 2 dozen clubs and organizations and groups and so forth that may enjoy or at least tolerate a speech from one of us or a conversation on this issue. I know I've reached out to some groups where I am. It's not going to happen if we just continue speaking with ourselves, to ourselves, as stimulating as these conversations are, and they really are incredible. So with that, I will
Thanks,
pass it back.
Herb. I've put a link to the Vision for a Healthy Planet document in the chat, and I think, you know, following up on these sorts of conversations and trying to find a broader audience is just crucial. We really struggle with that. Brian.
Yes, first, responding to Daniel, I agree we have to move beyond nationalism, and we're seeing terrible examples of nationalism in Russia and other countries. I was very surprised to learn that the word Nazi in German is national. And so really, it's really ironic that Putin is railing against Nazi when he's practicing the nationalist. He just needs a German dictionary, I think. Maybe to be enlightened. That said, I will point to the work of Harari, who said, why did we evolve from tribes to nations? We evolved in order to solve common problems. The example being a river that would alternately flood and drought and flood and drought. And so finally nations came together and said, let's build a dam. We build a dam, we can actually regulate the flow down the river and get a decent food security for each of our tribes by coming together as a nation. Now we're dealing with an atmospheric river of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to move from nations to a global framework. And you know, civilization can no longer tolerate the luxury of the tyranny of autocracy. We have to move beyond that to democratic and better approaches. I just read a paper this week about a median voting approach, which algorithmically does produce very good results, and it could be a model for future multinational cooperation. So it is actually highly robust to a few defectors. And so I do recommend that we look at that as a new model for how governance can work going forward. So we have to deal with this atmospheric river of greenhouse gases. I propose that we need to do that with multinational cooperation, and we need to build that. You know, in response to something that John and others said, you know, it'd be great if we could go to the top and just get our leadership to do that. But sadly, governments and large organizations tend to be trailing and not leading organizations. So we actually have had US senators tell us point blank, direct one-on-one, that they will do nothing until there is a mandate to change. And that means building grassroots and having charismatic megafauna and getting pieces like our vision statement out to the public and building support that is going to be grassroots support. So I think that is going to be absolutely essential, finding ways to do that. I'm glad to see that Aria McKenna is here because she is so great at public outreach, both with her panels and webinars and films and other media. So I think we need to use the media and become more experts in that regard to build what I'm going to call social acceptance for actually regenerating a healthy climate in our lifetime, and ultimately a demand. And eventually, with that mandate in place, we'll be able to make this happen. But it needs to start grassroots and one-on-one. And happy to follow up on how we make that happen. So this is Brian. I'm complete.
Thanks, Brian. We've got Grant and then Aria.
Thank you, Robert. I had taken on a task this year to pass on the message to people, real people, just the people in my neighborhood, in my community, in my county, and eventually the state. And since I announced that, I have provided an outline for myself anyway, which I intend to plagiarize material from HPAC's excellent material, and we'll be setting up a conversation with the editor and publisher of our little local newspaper in the next week to see whether he can communicate this on a consistent basis with the goal of creating a column that gives a repeating statement of there is a future that is worth living to. And so that's what I'm going to try doing, and we'll look forward to giving you an update next.
Thanks, Grant. Aria.
Yes, hi, thank you, Robert. So I did put a question in the chat, and I would love to hear some feedback from anyone. It was initially addressed to Brian, but I am curious if we were to be able to create that kind of social movement, understanding, political shift, everything that we're talking about here, say within the next 5 to 10 years, would we actually have the capacity to restore climate to pre-industrial levels? Like, is that still a possibility under all the right social conditions? I'm curious to hear people's thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question, Aria. And I think aligning with Robert Chris, no, it's not possible to restore all aspects of the pre-industrial climate, but it is possible to regenerate healthy climate in our lifetime in just a few short decades with the political will to do so. And that's what we must build, is that will. And part of it comes from hope. I mean, a lot of people just don't know that the solutions are there to actually refreeze the Arctic and regenerate healthy habitat. Everyone would love to save the polar bears, but until now, it hasn't been really described how we can save the habitat of the polar bears and the walruses and the Arctic environment, including the Arctic marine algae. So there's a great hope. In fact, we've designed a form of Arctic marine permaculture that can actually help to refreeze the Arctic and reestablish the marine algae that occurs underneath the ice. There are multiple ways of doing it. I think what's new is that we actually have approaches that can get us back to a healthy climate, not the one we were born in, but one that can have a bright future for civilization and the other 8 million species who don't get to vote.
How would you quantify what you mean by safe climate there? What would that mean to you?
Yeah, I didn't say safe, but I did say healthy, and that would be
healthy,
one where
better, even better.
Okay, good.
What does that mean?
Temperatures within boundaries. The giant. We ask, all right, why has the last 10,000 years been Goldilocks? Right, not too cold, not too warm. Well, a lot of it has been the buffering capacity of the ice. I mean, the ice. It's like if you take a glass. I think of the planet Earth as a glass of ice water. And it's got, and you can heat up that ice water all you want, and it won't change temperature until that last ice cube melts. And when that last bit of sea ice melts, watch out when it comes to ocean temperatures, because it's going to go off like a rocket. So it behooves us to keep some ice in the glass. And that's exactly what we're talking about, refreezing the Arctic.
So is the reason why you're saying we wouldn't be able to restore temperatures to pre-industrial because you're not seeing a way to actually be able to restore ice to pre-industrial? Would that be a major factor?
There's so many dimensions to climate that the whole presumption of restoring climate will put a lot of ecologists on the wrong side of the fence. So rather than saying, well, we're going to restore it back to where it was on all these dimensions, temperature, carbon dioxide levels, ice extent. I mean, you can come up with dozens of variables. We need to get back to a healthy climate that can actually be stable. And that involves refreezing the Arctic. It involves getting back to temperature, but it also involves active cooling. And the point is, in the near term, we're going to have a different climate, right? Because we may use aerosols or other approaches to get back to a reasonable temperature. CO2 will be too high, and we've got to bring that down, but we can still have a healthy climate on the way. It may take us decades, if not a century, to get all 2,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. But on the way, we can have a healthy climate if we use active cooling techniques. And that's why we need to build a demand for regenerating healthy climate rather than asking for exactly the same climate that we had before. And that's our hope too. And that's why I differ with Peter Fikowski.
We've had this debate in, like our group is called Planetary Restoration Action Group. And so we've had this debate with Brian about the meaning of restoration versus regeneration, which we accept more accurate and scientifically acceptable term. Our view has been that restoration is a simpler word that can engage with a broader audience to say, sure, we're not going to have exactly the same climate that we grew up with or before, but we're looking at especially restoring temperature. And so it's possible for us to say that we can restore the Holocene temperature in order to maintain the sea level that has given us beaches and ports and coastal ecosystems. So it won't be the same as the past, partly because there's been such a massive extinction process. But so you can't, extinction is forever. But so you can't completely restore, but still in that broad sense of restoring, like the idea that we can cut the temperature. Like I was going to go back to this optimism versus realism, and I think that there's a lot of false optimism, and we see it particularly in the zero emission commitment community,
Right.
where they're saying, if we can just achieve net zero, then we can be optimistic about the climate returning to stability, and that's just nonsense. So we have to start from realism about the future of the climate, but then humans, going back to Brian's reference to Asimov, with humans expanding through the galaxy over millions of years. It's this sort of extraordinary science fiction type of vision. At the moment, many people are worried that we'll go extinct in this century, that our children have no hope. And but it's so I think being optimistic about the capacity of humans to evolve, to use our minds as the tool of evolution, and not rely on genetic evolution, but have a mental evolution that will transform our planet.
That's a great point, Robert. I'm going to quote the creator of The Biggest Little Farm. I went to the premiere of that in Santa Barbara, and I was sitting near the front, and afterwards he was taking questions. And one person asked, what gives you hope that you're actually, or what gives you hope that we're actually going to get out of this well? And the filmmaker said, the greatest restoring force on the planet is the conscious will of collective consciousness, and starting with a few people, but spreading broadly. And I think that is the greatest restoring force, is our ability to be conscious and to understand what it's going to take to identify good solutions. So I think that'll be a key part. And, I would love to restore temperatures, which would be great, but the temperatures, it's not one temperature, right? There is a global temperature, but you've got a million temperatures distributed all over the planet. And of course, there'll be winners and losers. There will be some places that are warmer and some places that are colder. So it is complex. And I want to bring our ecologists along with us. And they're going to be very finicky about the word restoration, which is why I continue to lobby for a generation, but happy to have that conversation later as desired.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. I would love to just, I would love to have more time to discuss this in greater detail as well. And maybe we can have a follow-up conversation about it. And one of the reasons is because I'm finally getting to the point where I'm going to start sharing my TV series that I've mentioned to you. And I really want to make sure that the plot line, when it comes to the concept of restoration, get more input about what would be possible within what period of time and what will need to happen in order to support that optimistic, hopeful vision of the future that is meant to inspire action. Because the entire point of optimism is that, okay, yes, I can do it only if I do everything that is possible and necessary in order to get to that goal, right? So it's like, actual realistic optimism, as you mentioned before, versus the just completely out of touch optimism that supports junk science, essentially, which is the way I'm interpreting what Michael Mann is saying right now, which is incredibly unfortunate. And just to touch really quickly, because I know we're closing here, but I have been thinking while I've been listening to this conversation on my drive that it's reaching. I mean, I would love to reach out to Bloomberg Green, for instance, if we could get them to rally behind the idea of supporting regular content creation with people in this group and amongst our colleagues and beyond, to cover the supporting climate restoration strategies, regeneration strategies, healthy climate, all of these ideas in a way that just kind of levels up the conversation in a way that can be engaging to people. That could be a way to get the kind of impact that I think that we would need to support these conversations. So that's just an idea that is formulating right now.
We've got about
Wonderful.
5 minutes to go. So what I'd like to do is, so we'll have John Nissen will finish off the call, but I'd like to just ask if there's a couple people on the call who haven't spoken, Akim and Jonathan. And what I suggest is we go to Robert Chris now, and then if Akim or Jonathan wish to make some brief comments, and then let John Nissen conclude by the top of the hour. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I just wanted to make an observation that when they say when you're if you're a detective trying to solve a crime, that you should follow the money. And I think there's a parallel here that in the whole climate change discourse, what we should be doing is following the power, because it's the power that drives whatever happens. The power is what drives what's happening in the climate, and it's the power that drives what happens socially. So one of the reasons, just dealing with the climate first, one of the reasons that we are now so focused on temperature is because it's the temperature, which is the energy that is actually responsible for the concerns that we have and the changes that we have. The carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gases are kind of instrumental in this. They are causing that, but the carbon dioxide, apart from the ocean acidification, the carbon dioxide itself is not a toxic gas. It's not actually itself causing a problem. What the problem is being caused by the energy change that is caused by the CO2. So the focusing on the energy and focusing on the power, which in this case is sunlight, I think really does crystallize why we are concerned about this. And on the other side, on the social side, we live in very complex societies where the power is very concentrated in the hands of a relatively small cadre of people. And we find this all the time, that publics generally can rail against the system, they can demonstrate, they can be disobedient, they can cause all sorts of mayhem, but rarely does the power from below really change rapidly what is going on at the top. There are always changes happening. It's always adaptations. If we're talking about a radical change in a very short time, which is really what we need now, this very rarely happens from beneath. It does happen. Think of the French Revolution, think of the American Civil War. These are classic examples of where the uprising from beneath eventually comes to a head. And we need to be thinking in those terms, because the idea of a kind of a gradual realization, a mobilization of the public to eventually convince the powers that be that they need to change, and the politicians manage to disassociate themselves from the oil sector, and we don't have time. We do not have time for that. So somehow we've got to break through that. So focusing on the power, both in the climate and socially, I think is the real key to this and how it should be framed. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Robert. Now, would Akim or Jonathan like to speak? Akim.
Yeah, happy to say something. Yeah, I know I'm always listening in mostly, but that's usually that's me as well. In bigger groups around the table, you would never see me too much speaking, so this is not unusual. And it's an unusual setting for me. I feel a little bit the outsider, because of my technology. I'm not doing anything with solar SRM. I'm using a different cooling tech. I'm also not a politician, really. I have no idea how to do, I'm not an activist. I don't know how to work with the grassroots. My background is more with the large corporates where I did consultancy in the past. So I understand how they tick. I actually did some projects for big oil and gas. So that's where I'm coming from. But this whole is very useful for me to listen in, especially also the beginning of the session today when you talked through all the different papers. Because what I'm going to do is, I think in 3 or 4 weeks' time, I'm meeting a very influential climate think tank in London. It's one of my former colleagues or directors at the consultancy I used to work for. He founded that one, and they are highly networked and influential. And I told him I want to talk about cooling, and I'm trying to get a storyline together. So by all the papers that you've quoted and that were put into that's very useful. I've just had a little library, and I need to go through them. My only concern there is, and if anybody has any guidance, is are there any ones I should avoid where the name will be ripped to pieces? For me, it's always a reputation check in the background, because if I use the wrong person and then I lose my own credibility. I will only have 30 minutes with a guy who's really smart and who knows communication, who works with government, who works with, used to work with BP and Shell at the top exact level. It's that type of person. You can't bullshit him, and I can't feed him dodgy numbers, so that's what I'm doing at the moment. I only have 30 minutes with him, and I'm trying to bring my storyline together. You talked about that storyline earlier, and starting with I think for me it's the 1.5. That's my hook that I'm using. With the World Economic Forum, there was a video of 2 minutes where one guy from a German institute from Potsdam was basically saying, this is not we need to hit it, basically. It's not a choice. It's not a political statement. We must hit 1.5, and then bring in all the other statements that we're not going to hit it by IPCC and all the other ones. So I'm trying to build a very simple storyline together to be as impactful as possible, to leave no gaps in the logic where they can escape, and then ask him, so what can we do now? So that basically cooling is, well, the only option really going forward. So from that perspective, it's really helpful for me to listen into all of this, and we'll see what comes out of it. And if something comes out of it, obviously I will report it back and see what I can. All I can do in half an hour really with them is try to whet their appetite somehow, make them really interested, that they want to have another longer meeting with me, longer session with me. And I just need to make sure that I come across as credible and that they can't shoot any holes into my argumentation. So
thanks very much, Arkham. That's good. What we'll do is we'll just invite John Nissen to make a final comment and then end the meeting. Thank you.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that rooftop solar, for instance, got a really great boost in the United States from the subsidies that the government threw in. In fact, one could argue that Solar City and some of the others came into existence to capture those billions of subsidies. When carbon offset value gets to $200 per offset ton, a whole new industry will emerge. Because even myself, I've got designs for devices that only work at that level. At the current $20 per ton level, it's totally useless to even try to build them. I have to wait till that new price point emerges. So when that price point emerges, I predict we'll have an excellent emergence of new industries. That's all.
Thanks, Jonathan. John.
Okay, so to answer about who to trust, I would put my money on Hansen, on the effect of decarbonisation, pushing the temperature up, and so the logic behind that is obviously that we've got to cool, and he also says avoid tipping points, so that confirms the need to cool the Arctic in particular. So that's my answer to him. A comment to Brian. I was asking right at the beginning, can we have some support for from ecologists that actually cooling the planet will be helpful helpful to ecosystems, and Robert mentioned, of course, that we've got this poleward drift of boundaries between different ecosystems, which is leading to a loss of biodiversity.
In a nutshell,
so we can reverse that, but there seems to be something that worries the ecologists about cooling the planet a bit.
Well, no, the key thing is this, restoration, they have a very precise definition of restoration, and you're going to get all crosswise with the ecologists. If you talk about restoration, we really need to work towards regenerating healthy habitat, and that won't be the same as what it was before, but it will be a refrozen Arctic, and it will have a reasonable distribution of temperatures. So I think we have to speak the language of the ecologists to bring them on side, and that's essential to build.
Okay. Can we work together on the terminology there, Brian?
Definitely happy to do that.
Yeah, good, good, excellent. So thank you, everybody. I think we are at a tipping point as far as climate change is concerned, because people are desperately worried about the growth in weather extremes, and IPCC is not providing a timely solution. And if you look at the International Energy Authority's forecast for CO2 levels in 2050, it's 37 gigatons CO2 emissions at the moment. They expect it to go down to 32 by 2050. That's with their plan, which they call STEPS, which is quite ambitious. So that's what they're saying it is realistic.
All right, thanks everyone. We do need to finish up, so look forward to seeing you again shortly, and I'll circulate the recording of the meeting from today.
All right, thank you, Robert. And can you capture the chat as well?
Yes,
Thank you.
that. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.